entire Wacom, you see what's happening is it's reflecting my computer rather than showing me the keyboard of the tablet. So that is going to be a problem.
It's okay. It's like Puli or Shuli or something, So leave it. Ah, that's gone.
It's gone, but my pen is also gone.
No, because it's in eraser mode. Go back to
Okay,
now. Choose a pen.
okay. No, I can't see the rest of you.
You don't have to.
But
As long
presumably
as
I
you're
can
using
if
your pen. Yeah, that's okay.
no, the point
Don't
is
bother.
everybody is hidden completely, and I don't know
That's
how to
okay.
mute my video.
Don't bother. Don't bother.
Don't bother.
Oh, muting
Well,
the
won't
video
it be
is just at the
distracting?
bottom left, and there is a camera thing. You just click on it. Don't bother. We want to see you. Okay. Yeah,
I
yeah,
can't see any of you, so I'm doing this completely blind.
yeah. That's okay. That's okay.
No, but what's the way by which I can get back to? One thing I've learned is one shouldn't move this mouse around because it creates problems on that screen.
No, I mean nothing. But if you stop sharing, it will come back. I mean, so. No, no. I
I
think you
see.
start. Can we
Okay.
start your lecture now? You just give your lecture.
Uh, Wait a minute. It's exactly 2:32 or so.
Yeah.
Okay. So you want to say something or?
Yeah. I mean, hello everybody. I'm Suresh Konandarajan. I taught you classical mechanics, and that's Professor Balakrishnan. And there was some popular request for some talks by him. So here is Professor Balakrishnan. I don't know what he's going to talk about. Hopefully he knows. Bala, you may speak.
Okay, that's called a pious hope because I don't know what I'm going to talk about either. I wish there's some way by which I could see the audience. Uh,
No, Bala,
Suresh,
it doesn't work.
can
It doesn't work. Even when I lecture, I don't see.
you don't see? Okay, all right.
I
I
just
hope this works. And the only thing I need to know is how to change the page. Wait a
add a
minute.
page or something. Does Sunitra
You see,
know how to add a
no, what's
page?
happening? No, no. What is happening is that. Oh, come on. You see, there's this eraser mode, and I'm not able to get rid of it.
So you go and click on the pen. Choose the pen. It's like you have to choose, right? You have a pen, right?
Oh,
You
okay.
click
Right.
you choose
Okay.
now you got it.
Okay. Now the only thing is whether the stylus is going to work on the computer screen. It doesn't. The stylus works only on the tablet
Yeah, so you have to look at the tablet
and
and see some. Yeah, I mean,
see page. Okay, I got the icon. Right.
okay,
All right. So I'm all set to go.
okay. Please start. Please start.
What I'd like to do is to first give a small recap of Hamiltonian dynamics and then show you what the mathematical structure behind it is. I'm really grateful to Suresh for having agreed to waste his time by spending his valuable time sitting here through this and acting as an interlocutor between me and the class, entirely because of my technical inaptitude. I'm not sure about the technology behind this tablet business, and he will take care of the problems. I'd also like to request those listening to interject and ask questions. This is not a formal lecture. I don't have notes. I don't have transparencies or anything like that. I'm just going to write on this tablet. And if there's any question, please ask it right then rather than wait till the end of the lecture. In fact, I'd like to just go by questions and answers if it's possible at all. So let me kick off by uh, settling a few preliminaries, and that's the following. I presume you've all learned classical mechanics, classical dynamics in a formal sense. You've learned about Lagrangians and Hamiltonians and so on. I'm going to quickly recapitulate Hamiltonian dynamics for a finite number of degrees of freedom and then show you what the underlying mathematical structure is. And if I get to it and time permits and it's convenient, then we will talk about dynamical symmetry in Hamiltonian systems. So a certain amount of prior knowledge is already assumed, but if there's anything at all that's causing a doubt, please stop and ask me a question right away so that we can settle it. And Suresh, if he kindly transmits the question to me, either he answers it himself or he lets me know what's happening and I will answer it. Okay. So what is a general dynamical system that we can think of? If you're given a set of variables x1, x2, dot, 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 up to x sub n, n of these variables, let's assume them all to be real variables, and I'm going to call these together equal to, I'll occasionally use this symbol x vector to show that it's an n-dimensional vector. Then a dynamical system, in one sense of the word, a formal way of defining it, is to say that x changes as a function of time according to some vector valued function f, which is also a function of this x, as well as possibly the time, where both x and f are elements of Euclidean space in n dimensions. So this would be one way of formally defining a dynamical system, where a set of variables whose time evolution is described by a first order set of equations. These are first order in time. The dot denotes the derivative with respect to the time, which runs from 0 upwards, say. Now, the moment you have the t dependence here, the system becomes non-autonomous. And it creates its own complications, because it means that the rule by which the system changes as a function of time is itself time dependent. It goes on changing from time to time. A more simpler possibility in this case is autonomous systems for which x dot is simply equal to f of x, where this f of x is some suitably defined vector valued function, and this function can be highly nonlinear in x. So most of classical dynamics is very, very highly nonlinear. And the task then is, given x at time 0, to find x at time t, any time t afterwards. If you can do this in a closed form by integrating this set of equations, for instance, then the system is said to be integrable. But if you can't integrate in general, what you can always do is, in the space of these n variables, if this point denotes x of 0, after some time it becomes x of delta t, and then x of 2 delta t, x of 3 delta t, and so on. We can solve this differential equation or set of differential equations, coupled equations, numerically using some time step delta t on the computer, and you find a phase trajectory corresponding to the given value x of 0. If you start with some other initial condition, it might be like this, for instance. One thing is for sure, since the system is autonomous, these phase trajectories cannot intersect at all, because if they intersect, the future is not uniquely determined by the past, which is contrary to what this differential equation says. So the trajectories don't intersect in autonomous systems, and they are curves of various kinds, complicated curves in phase space. Now, what's the input information that you need for this general dynamical system? You need to know this vector valued function f, or this function f. We need to know that. Okay. So you need n pieces of information. These functions f are to be defined beforehand, are to be prescribed to you beforehand. On the other hand, there are various kinds of special dynamical systems, of which the Hamiltonian dynamics is one of them, and a very, very important one, because it's the starting point for many, many applications, both classically and quantum mechanically. What happens in such a case is a great simplification. You're given a function h, a single scalar function h, the Hamiltonian, of all the dynamical variables, which in the case of the Hamiltonian are variables which come in pairs. So QP, where Q stands for a set of generalized coordinates q1 dot dot up to q little n, and P stands for the conjugate momenta p1 dot 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 up to p little n. So you're given a function h of these q's and p's, possibly also time, But if you put in time, then the system becomes non-autonomous. And since we've said we'll restrict ourselves in this, at least this set of lectures, to autonomous systems, I will just write h of qp. And I'll use the shorthand little q for the set of coordinates and little p for the set of momenta here. And whenever I have a product like qp, it's understood that qp will actually stand for summation over I equal to 1 to n q sub I p sub I. Then Hamilton's equations of motion tell you what the dynamical system looks like, how it evolves, and these equations are q dot is delta h over delta p. By this I mean for each component here, qi dot and delta h over delta pi dot, where I runs from 1 to n. I've said I'm going to omit this subscript every now and then. And p dot is minus delta h over delta q in this fashion. So you have a set of 2n first order ordinary differential equations, and you have to specify initial conditions. So q at time 0 is given to you, p at time 0 is given to you, and you need to find q at any time t and p at any time t. Is there a hope of doing this at all? Generically, no, not at all. But there's a very special feature here of Hamiltonian systems which I want you to appreciate right away. That is, a single scalar function h actually prescribes for you the time evolution of all 2n variables, dynamical variables, by this set of equations here called Hamilton's equations. So this is the remarkable thing about Hamiltonian dynamics, that everything in the dynamics is completely specified by specifying the Hamiltonian function here itself. So we need to be able to integrate this. Once again, what's the procedure for integration? Well, one way would be to try to eliminate variables here, get higher order differential equations for some of the q's, solve it, etc. But generically, this problem is not integrable in the sense that you cannot find q of t and p of t as some smooth analytic functions of q of 0 and p of 0. But we can make a lot of progress depending on what kind of Hamiltonian you have. And what we're going to go through now is a systematic way of approaching this problem and finding out under what conditions this is possible. Under what conditions is this possible? When is it integrable? As opposed to merely solvable. So that is going to be our task. And what's the way to do this? Well, a number of small preliminaries have to be defined. And the first of these is the following concept. Oh, I should have mentioned something here. I should have said that now for a bit of formal language, means I'm going to talk about the symplectic structure of classical dynamics, Hamiltonian dynamics. Might as well say it here in words, and later if there's interest in it, I will talk about it a little more in detail. These Qs are elements of what's called configuration space, sometimes denoted by capital Q. Bad notation because I'm going to use capital Q for the canonical transform of little q. But anyway, that's the way the notation usually goes. It's called configuration space. And these P's live in a different space altogether. This configuration space could be anything at all. It could be, for instance, the surface of a sphere, like this. It could be this. Then this point here is a typical little q in this case. And at that point, this configuration space has a tangent space of the same dimensionality, and the velocities q dots live on that space. They form a linear vector space because whenever you have a manifold like this, a q configuration space, and you find a tangent space to it at that point, it has the same dimensionality, little n, as the original space q. And then on this tangent space, the q dots live, their vectors on this tangent space. The tangent space is a Euclidean space, and its dual is also Euclidean, and that dual space is called the cotangent space. For each q, you take the corresponding cotangent space, and the little p's live on that. And to be correct technically, I should really write q superscript I to show that it's what we would call in tensor calculus a contravariant vector. And the little p's are what are called covariant vectors or covectors, and they have downstairs indices. These live on the configuration space, and these fellows live in the dual to the tangent space at that point. The collection of these dual spaces are called the cotangent bundle, and phase space itself, which is the space in which the q's and p's live, is usually denoted by T star q to show that it's the cotangent bundle of the manifold Q, configuration space Q. Now, this sounds like a lot of jargon, which it is, in fact, but the fact is that I want to emphasize that if you want to be extremely careful mathematically, you must ensure that you understand that one of them is upstairs indices and the other is lower indices here. But I'm not going to focus on that aspect here at all. I'm going to do something totally different. So here goes nothing. I don't know how to get back to this space. Okay. All right. So the first concept that we need when we want to integrate these equations is that of Poisson brackets. And let me explain what those brackets are. You would have already studied that.
All these things, they've seen Poisson brackets and symplectic structure very little in my course.
Have they seen Poisson brackets at all?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
so what I'll do is I'll define the Poisson brackets as would have been defined in class already in terms of partial derivatives and so on. And then I will give a more geometrical meaning of this Poisson bracket in terms of the symplectic matrix, etc. I'll do that. You haven't talked about that, Suresh, have you?
I gave one assignment problem. I do
Uh-huh.
remember. But I think no, that you can
Okay, okay. I'll elaborate it when I get to that. Now, if you have a function of phase space variables, f of q sub comma p in general, all the coordinates and momenta, and a second one, g of q comma p, then you define what's called a Poisson bracket of f with g to be, at this stage, it's the definition, but we'll get a better definition or a more geometrical definition a little later. This is a summation over I equal to 1 to n, delta f over delta qi, delta g over delta pi, minus delta f over delta pi, delta g over delta qi. Now, I might wonder where this weird structure comes from, but as I said, I will interpret it geometrically and then it will hopefully become much clearer as to where this comes from. Now, this immediately implies the following. Since the q's are generalized coordinates independent of each other and the p's are corresponding generalized momenta independent of each other, it immediately follows that you have qi with qj equal to 0 equal to pi with pj, and the most important relation, qi with pj, is a Kronecker delta on the right hand side, delta ij. So it's equal to 1 only for the Poisson bracket of a particular q with its own p, and 0 in all other cases here. These are called canonical Poisson brackets. So let me write that. Canonical, standard, canonical PDs. And they, in a sense, they define the system, they define the standard, the coordinates and the momenta, if you like, the primary property of it. But this Poisson bracket already has some very, very interesting properties. And let's write those properties out carefully. The first property is that f with a constant times g is k times f with g. That's a trivial statement because the constant doesn't get differentiated by any of the coordinates or momenta and it comes out of the bracket. The second property is an antisymmetry property, f with g, and it's obvious on inspection, g with f. Okay. The third property is the Leibniz chain rule for differentiation, which says f with g times h, g and h being functions of phase space variables, is f with g times h plus g times f with h. As you all know, in quantum mechanics, one way of approaching quantum mechanics is to say that the Poisson bracket goes over into the commutator divided by IH cross. And in that case, you have to worry about the order of these factors, which is the reason why I put F in front here, G in front here, because I shouldn't have done that. That's okay. Yeah, that's correct. So F with G with H on the right hand side of G, and G with F with H with G on the left hand side of H, right? So this is just good practice to do this so that you don't make a mistake when you go to quantum mechanics and deal with commutators instead. So this is the Leibniz chain rule. This is antisymmetry. This is chain rule. And finally, you also have the other property, which is very, very crucial. F with G with H plus cyclic permutations is identically equal to 0. This is called the Jacobi identity. And it has a mathematical reason for existing, because it will turn out that these functions of phase space variables are actually elements. They form a Lie algebra, and this algebra we will discuss what this algebra is a little while later. And this property of the Jacobi identity also has a certain meaning. When you take this algebra and exponentiate it and make a Lie group out of it, you want the group elements, group multiplication to be associative, and that implies the Jacobi identity, or rather the Jacobi identity implies associativity for the finite group elements. Now that might be just jargon again at the moment, but let's just keep these properties in mind here. Okay. So given this much, any questions? Any questions so far?
None so far, but there's one more property, linearity. I mean,
yes, I forgot that. Yeah. So F with G plus H, or constant times G plus some other constant times H, you can generalize it, is equal to F with G plus F with H, which is linearity. Okay. Well, loosely speaking, this antisymmetry plus the Jacobi identity, these properties define what's called a Lie algebra, but we'll not go into this. Just to call attention for a minute, just to make give an example which is familiar to you. If you recall the cross product of two vectors in ordinary three-dimensional Euclidean space, it has precisely the same properties, and like the Poisson bracket has. These properties are common because A cross B is minus B cross A out here, this antisymmetry property, and then the triple vector product A cross B cross C plus B cross C cross A, etc., that's equal to 0. And then these other properties are also valid. So these are actually properties of what's called a Lie algebra, which is what the Poisson brackets do. They form. Now, having done this, the next step is to find out what is meant by a constant of the motion. So let's do it in the following way. I'll call it a COM, a constant of the motion. So any function f of q, p, and possibly t, because that's what will happen in physical applications all the time, is a constant of the motion if and only if df over dt equal to 0 on every phase trajectory. In other words, as the q's and p's evolve in time from some given initial values, if this quantity df over dt, the total derivative, time derivative of f is 0, then we have a constant of the motion. And these constants of the motion are obviously very crucial because the motion is restricted to the level surface of such a constant of motion. The Hamiltonian itself for autonomous Hamiltonians is a constant of the motion in a trivial way. It doesn't change with time, as we'll see in a second here. What is this quantity df over dt? Well, it's got a functional dependence on q, so it's delta f over delta q, q dot, summed over little components I, plus delta f over delta p, p dot, plus possibly an explicit dependence on time, so delta f over delta t. And this should be 0 for a constant of the motion, but then on a solution trajectory, that's implied on a phase trajectory, delta f over delta q times delta q dot is delta h over delta p by the Hamiltonian equations of motion, minus, because p dot is minus delta h over delta q, this is delta f over delta p, delta h over delta q, plus delta f over delta t. But this is equal to the Poisson bracket of f with h plus delta f over delta t. And this must be 0 for a constant of the motion, equal to 0 for a constant of the motion. So it's immediately clear that if f did not have explicit time dependence, then f is a constant of the motion if and only if, so for f of qp alone, no t dependence, it's a constant of the motion if and only if the Poisson bracket of f with the Hamiltonian is equal to 0, identically equal to 0. Otherwise, it's not a constant of the motion. When two quantities have a Poisson bracket which is equal to 0 identically, they are said to be in involution. They are in involution. So a function that is not explicitly dependent on t is a constant of the motion in Hamiltonian dynamics if and only if it is in involution with the Hamiltonian, or a better way of putting it in analogy with quantum mechanics is to say it Poisson commutes with the Hamiltonian of the system. If f has time dependence, a time-dependent constant of the motion, a constant of the motion which has explicit time dependence, and there are plenty of them, is a constant of the motion if and only if it is not in involution and this combination vanishes. This whole thing has to become 0. So the time dependence here must be cancelled by that here. This function must cancel that there. So that's the reason why you have this extra piece here. Okay. So what can we say once we've got this much, that you have a constant of the motion? And we have, what can we say about this? Well, it is immediately clear that h of qp Hamiltonian equal to a constant of the motion right away, because it Poisson commutes with itself. So this is a trivial statement that you have a constant of the motion. Every time you have a constant of the motion is restricted, because from 2n dimensional phase space you need a trajectory, and you have a quantity that is constant in time, that is a 2n minus 1 dimensional hypersurface. If you had a second constant of the motion must be restricted to the intersection of the level surfaces of these two constants of the motion, which makes it 2n minus 2, and so on. And if you had 2n minus 1 time independent constants of the motion, then the system is restricted to a one-dimensional space and becomes a trajectory. So the idea is to get more and more constants of the motion, because then you're getting closer and closer to complete integrability. So one would therefore think that I need to have 2n constants of the motion till I hit just a one-dimensional thing, a 2n minus 1 constants of the motion in 2n dimensional phase space, 2n minus 1 time independent constants of the motion. But you could also look at this trajectory as a trajectory in 2n dimensional phase space and time. So you have extended phase space, which has 2n plus 1 dimensions. So to draw a picture, for instance, if you have Q here and P here, you could draw time on this axis, and the trajectory is some weird curve in this extended phase space here. Then for you to get a trajectory, you must have two n constants of the motion, at least one of which must be time dependent. Otherwise, there is no motion in this system at all. So we have a formidable task. We need to find either 2n minus 1 time independent constants of the motion, or 2n time dependent, some of which are time dependent constants of the motion here. But a miracle now happens because of a Hamiltonian system. The structure of this Hamiltonian dynamics is that a minor miracle happens, and it leads to the following criterion. And this is called the Liouville Arnold criterion. For integrability. And it says the following interesting thing. It says, if, and I'll put that in capital letters, if there exists n constants of the motion, and they must be independent of each other. They must be algebraically independent of each other, because you can't tell me the Hamiltonian is a constant of the motion, the square of the Hamiltonian, the cube of the Hamiltonian, they're all constants of the motion. So as many, I'll give you as many as you like. That's useless, because you need to have independent, functionally independent constants of the motion. And let me call them functionally independent constants of the motion. If there exist n phi coms, n, not 2n, n phi coms, and let's call them f1 dot up to fn, such that every Poisson bracket fi fj is 0. In other words, they are all in involution with each other. If this miracle happens, then H is integrable in a specific sense, and I will explain that in a second. Where is this eraser? I'm always hunting for this eraser, and I'm never able to find it. Oh, come on. That's a terrible joke. Integrable in the Liouville-Arnold sense. Yeah. So n alone is enough. This means you must be able to supply the other n, and that we will in a second. We'll see how this happens here. But this is the criterion that you have for integrability, that they must be in involution with each other here. Of course, it's obvious that a convenient thing to do is to take the Hamiltonian itself to be one of them, because we know it's a constant of the motion. So conventionally, what one does is to write F1 equal to H. Okay. And you need to find n minus 1 more constants of the motion, all of which are mutually Poisson commuting with each other. And then the system is integrable completely in a specific sense here. Now the question is, in what sense, and how does this come about? Where does this come about? And for this, I need to introduce another concept, and that is that of canonical transformations. Now, in general, what a canonical transformation does is the following. It's a change of variables. There are caveats on how you can change these variables, but I'll just say this very loosely in the beginning. It's a change of variables from the original set of dynamical variables, Q's and P's, to a new set, which is conventionally denoted by capital Q, capital P, not necessarily always, but most of the time, such that the following things happen. One, the canonical Poisson bracket relations are preserved. In other words, canonical Poisson brackets remain unchanged. Oh. In other words, Qi Pj equal to delta Ij, etc. Q with Q is 0, P with P is 0, and Q with P is delta Ij. That's the first thing. And the second thing that you need is that the Jacobian of this transformation, so delta of Qp divided by delta of little q little p. This is a 2n by 2n matrix, this Jacobian, and the determinant of that, which I'll denote by these bars here, is equal to +1. Now, what this step ensures is that phase space volumes are preserved under a canonical transformation. So this will immediately imply, for instance, that dq dp, where this is a 2n dimensional phase space element, because this stands for dq1 dq up to dqn, and this is for dp1 up to dpn, this must be equal to dq dp. But you would say, well, that happens, the volume is unchanged, even if you had a reflection, for instance, of all these variables. But it must be +1 here, so it must be orientation preserving. So an orientation preserving, measure preserving transformation, which leaves the canonical Poisson brackets unchanged, is called a canonical transformation when you set up variables here. Now, there's no guarantee that you will always be able to make canonical transformations for a given Hamiltonian, but if you can, then it must satisfy these properties here. And it has one huge consequence, big consequence of this, so huge that it's important to write. Canonical transformation implies that the Hamiltonian equations are unchanged. In structure, the structure of Hamilton's equations remains unchanged. What does that mean? It means that if h of qp goes to some other Hamiltonian in the new variables k of qp under a canonical transformation, this implies immediately that q dot is guaranteed to be delta k over delta p, and p dot is guaranteed to be minus delta k over delta q. Exactly as the original variables did with the Hamiltonian h. Now you might ask, what's the use of this sort of thing? Well, the use is that if I can find a clever change of variables such that k is simpler than h, then this set of equations hopefully is simpler than the original set, and I may be able to integrate it. And what the Liouville-Arnold criterion does is to say that this new k is a function only of the new p's and not of the new q's at all, in which case this term vanishes identically. So it immediately gives you n constants of the motion, the new p's, which are called action variables, by the way, and that also tells you how the new q's, which are called angle variables, change as a function of time. Excuse me. Sorry about that. So this is the use of a canonical transformation, and now we must study this a little further to see what this actually implies. There are many, many ways of doing this, and one of them is to introduce simple canonical transformations by giving you specific generating functions, but let me say what really is going on here. Since we've said that Hamilton's equations don't change at all under a canonical transformation, the corresponding Lagrangian must change in such a way that the action does not change at all. So this means that under a canonical transformation, the Lagrangian L must go to some Lagrangian L prime such that L minus L prime is equal to some total derivative df over dt of a function f of the coordinates and time possibly. But this equation will tell us how to handle canonical transformations immediately, because this implies that L dt minus L prime dt must be equal to df here. And now let's write this out. We know that the Hamiltonian is defined by a Legendre transform of the Lagrangian by PQ dot minus L, which I will write as L is PQ dot minus H. So L dt is equal to P dq minus H dt. And if I put it into this equation here, this thing here, then it implies that P dq minus H dt minus L prime dt. So there's a minus P dq plus K dt, because the new Hamiltonian is K, must be equal to df, the derivative f. And if this df is a function of the old coordinates and the new coordinates q and q, so q, q, and possibly t in this case. So this would be on the right hand side equal to delta f by delta q dq plus delta f over delta q d capital Q plus delta f over delta t capital F over dt here. And now we are home, because it immediately says that this coefficient P dq must match this quantity here. Similarly, this coefficient H dt must match this as well as this. So let me write those out here. I must say that P is delta F over delta Q, K is delta F over delta T plus H, partial derivative with respect to T plus H itself. And capital P now is minus delta F over delta Q. So if I write this out, P is equal to delta F over delta Q. Capital P is minus delta F over delta Q, and K is equal to H plus delta F over delta T. So it tells us what the new variables are in terms of the old ones as well as the Hamiltonian. What does that actually mean? How do you do this? Well, remember that this F was equal to F of Q, capital Q, and possibly T. So delta F over delta Q, if you evaluate, it will turn out to be a function of Q, capital Q, and T also, if you differentiate with respect to little q. So you must take this set of equations and find capital Q as a function of capital Q of Q, P, and T by eliminating such that you can write down capital Q in this equation in terms of Q, P, and T. Put that back in here and find capital P as a function of, so this will give you P as a function of little q, little p, and little t. And finally, putting both back in here and writing everything in terms of the new variables, this will give you k of q, p, and possibly t as a function of h of q of capital Q, capital P, T, P as a function of capital Q, capital P, T, and T if it existed in the beginning, plus delta F over delta T. So what's the important take-home lesson? It says that if your canonical transformation is time independent explicitly, by the way, this function F is called the generating function of the canonical transformation. It says if this capital F is not explicitly dependent on T, and you started with an autonomous dynamical system, then the new Hamiltonian is the old Hamiltonian expressed in terms of the new variables. It's just this portion. But if the canonical transformation is time dependent, then the new Hamiltonian is the old Hamiltonian expressed in the new variables plus the time derivative of the generating function here. So there's a piece here which I forgot to write this properly. plus delta F over delta T. So there's this extra piece sitting here. Yeah. So much for time-dependent canonical transformations. We'd like to write all this in much simpler notation than this whole thing. It's already very, very cumbersome, but we will come to that in a minute. And here is one canonical transformation which I want you to check out for yourself. For instance, suppose you take f of q to be equal to little q times capital Q itself. That's it. Check out that this is a canonical transformation. So find Q, find capital P, and find the new Hamiltonian K. Given an old Hamiltonian H of Q comma P autonomous, find capital Q, capital P, and capital K here. Verify that this is a canonical transformation here. And it's a very simple verification. But you could ask, is this the only kind of generating function? There are 4 types of generating functions. And the first type is a function f1 of little q and capital Q. There is f2 of little q and capital P. There's f3 of little p and capital Q. And there's f4 of little p and capital P. And each time you go from one type of canonical transformation to another, this is type 1, this is type 2, this is type 3, and this is type 4. You go from one to the other by doing a Legendre transform and changing variables. You're very familiar with this in thermodynamics when you go, for instance, from the internal energy U, which is a function of S, V, and N, namely this entropy, the volume, and the number of particles in the system for a single component system, thermodynamic system. You make a Legendre transform and you go to the Helmholtz free energy, which is a function of T, V, and N, which is given by U minus Ts. So you subtract Ts from it and get rid of this S and make it a function of T out there. And from there, you can go to the Gibbs free energy, which is a function of T, P, and N by adding once again U minus Ts to F plus PV to the Helmholtz free energy. Or you could also have got rid of this V here and gone straight away to the enthalpy, which is a function of S, P, and N by writing it as U plus PV. So these are all thermodynamic potentials, which in a state of thermal equilibrium would be at a minimum. The entropy is, of course, at a maximum, would be at a minimum, depending on what the control variables are. So if your system is such that you can control the temperature, the volume, and the number of particles, then in equilibrium, the Helmholtz free energy would be at a minimum. Similarly, for the Gibbs free energy, the internal energy, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So these are Legendre transforms, and that's exactly what you do to go from one type of canonical transformation to another type of canonical transformation. I might mention here that the same canonical transformation could have been either done with F1 equal to Q times Q, or you could have used F4 equal to P times P. So that should actually be the same canonical transformation could have been implemented with the generating function F4, which is P times capital P. I urge you to play with this a little bit to get familiar with it. Ask yourselves what would happen if I chose F2 to be equal to little q times capital P. It's clear that the derivatives of these generating functions, which are quadratic in this form, are all linear in the dynamical variables. So they would be examples of linear canonical transformations. Is this a canonical transformation? If so, what does it do? And similarly, what does this do? F3 equal to little p times capital Q. Is this a canonical transformation? And if so, what are the new variables? So it's very instructive to try this out as an exercise. Okay. I might as well give the answer here. This one will turn out to be the identity transformation. So it's a trivial canonical transformation. And this one will turn out to be a transformation. The q's, little q's become minus little q's and p's become minus little p's. So it's like a kind of inverting all that, redirecting all the axes in phase space here. So they're not doing anything for you. But that's not true of this canonical transformation or this here. This example also shows you, in this case, I might write the answer down, by the way, for this case here. Might as well write the answer down. It will turn out that capital Q is equal to little p and capital P equal to minus Q. And you can see that the Poisson bracket structure is immediately preserved. This also tells you that the distinction between generalized coordinates and generalized momenta is somewhat arbitrary. You can go from one to the other depending on the kind of description that you want, kind of variables that you choose here. So at the mathematical level, there is complete freedom, called one set of variables momenta and the other set of variables generalized coordinates. Although in physical applications, of course, you can distinguish between momenta and coordinates. Okay. So before I go to the next stage, which is to write down these equations, show how this leads to integrability, I'd like to ask if there are any questions. Suresh, are there any questions?
Yeah, brother. What? I nodded off.
Any questions? Well, I'm happy my voice is so soothing.
Yeah.
I try to keep an even keep it without too many high pitches or low pitches so that throughout my teaching career, I must say in a little personal note, that throughout my teaching career, one of my main concerns, even more than the concern that the student should figure out or understand what I'm saying, was that the student should not, under any account, be disturbed. Because as a student, I'm fully prepared for the possibility that their sleep began at 5 a.m. and ended at 6 a.m. or something like that. So. So any questions?
Yeah, any questions? Again, they're seeing canonical transformations in some form or the other.
Okay, good. All right, then let me quickly go through Liouville-Arnold integrability and then get to the real stuff that I wanted to talk about today, but which I haven't got to at all. But I will certainly start it off at least today. Okay, can I go on? Shall I go on?
Yeah.
Okay, so what happens when there exists F1 to Fn? In involution, there exists a canonical transformation such that little q, little p go over into what are called the angle variables theta, and the p's go over into what are called action variables q, theta, psi. These are called angle. For a reason I'm not going to give, angle variables, and these are called action variables. Okay, so you're guaranteed that there exists such a canonical transformation to action angle variables such that the Hamiltonian as a function of QP goes over into a Hamiltonian K of the thetas and i's, except that there is no theta dependence at all. A function purely of half the variables, the action variables I from 1 to n. This will immediately imply that theta dot, which was equal to delta k or delta I, with subscript little I, of course, understood here. And similarly, I dot equal to minus delta k over delta theta. This becomes identically equal to 0 because there's no dependence on theta in the new Hamiltonian k. So this implies that I dot is equal to 0, which implies I is a constant of the motion. So you have immediately found n constants of the motion. You need to have 2n minus 1 which are time independent, or 2n, some of which are time dependent. N of them are sitting in your pocket right away. The Hamiltonian, of course, is one of them already, but it doesn't matter. You've got n of these constants of the motion. But if you put this back, namely the i's are constant in time, k is a function only of the i's, so this equation becomes equal to omega, some constant omega, for each of these degrees of freedom, which is also a function only of the i's, because k is a function of the i's. So where has that got us? That says that I1 to In are constants of the motion, and theta I of t is equal to omega I times t plus theta I of 0, because remember that theta dot was equal to omega, a constant. So if you integrate that trivial equation, you get omega times t plus theta I of 0. So this implies immediately that theta minus omega t equal to a time-dependent constant of the motion, and there are n of these. So you have n time-independent constants of the motion, these guys, and you have n time-dependent constants of the motion, and the matter is over. You've actually integrated the whole thing completely. So the problem is completely solved because you found actually 2n constants of the motion, of which n are time independent and n are time dependent explicitly according to this. This is Liouville-Arnold integrability, and I urge you to study this carefully and see how delicate the mechanism is here. If you look at the example, which can be solved by many, many other methods as well, you don't need such a high-powered technique for it. Look at the simple harmonic oscillator, SHO. Then it turns out that your Q could be written as 2I over m omega square root times sine theta, and P can be written as 2I m omega square root cos theta. So this is the transformation, inverse transformation, which writes little q and little p in terms of the angle action variables theta and I in this case. Mind you, this is not going to polar coordinates in phase space in the QP plane at all, but check out that this is actually a canonical transformation and that it completely integrates the problem. In this case, the Hamiltonian, which was equal to p squared over 2m plus 1/2 m omega squared q squared goes to the Hamiltonian k, which is a function of I alone, which turns out in this case to be simply I omega itself. So this is another important lesson. It says the Hamiltonian can go to something else as a functional dependence of the new variables. It doesn't have to look like the old variables at all. It's now linear in the action variable here, and it's just a constant times the action variable in this particular simple instance here. And delta k over delta I is indeed omega, which is the frequency of the harmonic oscillator. Right from the beginning, we knew that all along here. So here is one example, a very trivial one though, of how the action angle variables work in this case. Now what I should like to do, there are many, many ways in which we can move, but what I'd like to do is the following. I'd like to show how this whole thing can be cast in a somewhat different language altogether. So I will start that off, and then the next time I will resume. How much time do I have, Suresh?
It's 3:30, so you can take about 20-25 minutes, and then we can have questions for 10 minutes.
All right. Is that okay with the audience? I mean, have they been lulled into a state of stupor?
No, well, I am awake now. Please.
Any questions?
Any questions? Bala, no questions.
Okay. All right. So let me give it a grand title. Although
Bala, there is a question.
Yeah. Sure. Please.
So it's not a question as such, but I didn't quite understand the part where you said that theta minus omega t is a constant of motion.
Good question. Good point. Very good point. Actually, I slurred over that, but I'm glad you caught that. Uh, you see, the equation for the theta is for each degree of freedom, theta I dot is delta k over delta I, that particular I dot here. That's the Hamilton equation for this angle variable here. The first set of equations, and this is true for every I from 1 to n. 1 less than equal to I less than equal to n here. But this k is a function of all the action variables alone. So what you have is delta over delta I subscript I of k, which is a function of I1, I2 up to In. And you have to take the partial derivative with the particular I that you've chosen here, for which you're writing this equation of motion. What is this going to be a function of? This is again going to be a function of I1, I2 up to In. Whatever you do with differentiating with respect to one of these variables, it gives you back a function of all these variables. So this is equal to some function, which depends on I, of course, because you're differentiating with respect to the ith action, omega I, again of function of I1 up to In. And that's a constant of the motion. If you give me all the i's, each of which is a constant of the motion, then the function of all the constants of the motion is again a constant of the motion. And let me call it omega I. So you now have an equation which says theta I dot equal to omega I, where omega I is a constant. And this is immediately integrable to read theta I itself as a function of t is equal to omega I, which is a function of all the i's times t plus the initial value, theta I of 0. But now I can rewrite this as theta I of 0 is equal to theta I of t, of course, that's a dynamical variable, minus omega is a constant, omega I times t. And this is guaranteed to be a constant of the motion. There is no time dependence, because the time dependence of theta I is cancelled by the time dependence of omega times t in a trivial sense. So therefore, this initial value is a constant of the motion. As you know, the numerical values of constants of the motion are all found by specifying the initial values of the dynamical variables. And that's exactly what this is saying. This combination is a constant of the motion, but there is explicit time dependence in this constant of the motion. So this part is not constant in time. This part is not constant in time, but the difference between the two is guaranteed to be a constant in time. So that's all I'm saying. It's a very simple illustration of a time-dependent constant of the motion. In fact, let me give an even simpler example, which you're all familiar with, but you've probably forgotten. If you take single particle motion in one dimension, h is p squared over 2m, on a line. So the particle is moving on a line. There's one constant of the motion. It's a trivial statement. This is immediately a constant of the motion. H is a constant of the motion. P is constant here. So in the phase plane, Q versus P, you give me some initial condition for the momentum, and the trajectories are simply curves of this kind. From minus infinity, if you start writing in time the trajectory, it looks like this. And the other half on the other side, the trajectories look like that. If you start with zero momentum, you remain right there in this fashion. But this is a constant of the motion. P is a constant. P equal to P naught equal to constant. But you could say, no, I'm going to work in extended phase space. Here's my Q, here's my P, and here's time in the third direction, T. Then what does the phase trajectory look like? Well, I need to specify two constants of the motion in that case. How do I do that? Well, one constant of the motion is already given to me here, because it says P is a constant, but in three-dimensional phase, extended phase space, P equal to constant is actually a plane of this kind, perpendicular to the P axis. Now you need one more constant of the motion whose intersection will give you the phase trajectory in the extended phase plane. And how do you do that? Well, you argue that x dot is delta h over delta p equal to p over m, which will imply that x of t equal to p of t, p times t over m plus x of 0 or q of 0. And then you have, lo and behold, a time dependent constant of the motion, which is x minus, so immediately it tells you x minus pt over m is the constant of the motion. And that's some complicated curve which will then give you the phase trajectory. It's another plane of some kind, which will give you the phase trajectory. So there's one constant of the motion, which is p, or h itself equivalently, because h is just p squared. And there's another constant of the motion, which is x minus pt over m. This is a dynamical variable. That's a dynamical variable which happens to be constant, and this is explicitly here, so that you have an explicit time-dependent constant of the motion in this problem. And the intersection of this plane p equal to constant with this quantity, constant of the motion surface, gives you the extended phase trajectory. It's in the same sense that those thetas become, the initial values of the thetas become constants of the motion. Sometimes you see this written in classical mechanics in a loose way in textbooks, which tell you that the constants of the motion are the initial conditions. That's a very bad way of saying it. The constants of the motion determine the numerical values of the constants of the motion. The initial values determine the numerical values of the constants of the motion, which may have very different interpretations altogether. So that's the right way to say it. Does that make it any clearer?
Yes. Can you actually, I have a question. There
Yeah,
is
sure.
this adiabaticity condition which one
Right.
puts on the action variable.
Right. I didn't want to
Is there
get into
some
that at
intuition
all.
for that? No, that's okay if you don't want to.
Yeah, but okay. Now I have to define action as integral PDQ and tell you what happens to that and talk about adiabatic invariance.
No. That I don't want that. I don't want that.
Huh.
But is there some intuition that that kind of condition is required?
Yes, because it's okay. This is probably a very loose way of saying it. In the case of periodic motion, it will tell you that small perturbations of closed trajectories will remain closed trajectories, small proper perturbations, right? For instance, if you took a pendulum, it's going back and forth in this fashion, and then I take this pendulum and I slowly shorten the length of the pendulum, you will still have periodic motion, but if you do this sufficiently slowly, the motion will still approximately be periodic with a changing period, because the L is changing as a function of time, slowly compared to the oscillation period here. So an adiabatic invariant is involved here in this case. Does that make it any clearer?
Okay, yeah, sure.
Are there any other questions? Okay, what I'm going to do now is to combine the Q's and P's into one dynamical vector X, which is the set of Q's and the set of P's in this fashion. And I'm going to write the Hamilton equations, which were X dot, sorry, it was Q dot is delta H over delta P, P dot is minus delta H over delta Q. This looks very suggestive of a gradient system. It looks like Q's and P's, the time derivatives are given by certain partial derivatives of H with respect to P and Q, except that this is P here and this is Q here. So there's a kind of twisted structure here. So what one does is the following. Let me define a matrix omega, a 2n by 2n dimensional matrix, which is the null matrix here and the null matrix here. Let me call it null matrix n by n matrix here. This is the unit matrix n by n unit matrix and minus the unit matrix n by n matrix here. So it's a 2n by 2n dimensional matrix with this definition. So in the 2 by 2 case, for example, when n equal to 1, this matrix would simply be 0, 1, minus 1, 0. When n equal to 2, it would simply be 0, 0, 0, 0 here, as well as 0, 0, 0, 0 here, and then it would be 1, 1, 0, 0, and minus 1, minus 1, 0, 0 on this side. It would be a thing like this. And this omega has some interesting properties. For instance, we know that omega transpose is equal to minus omega. Omega squared will turn out to be the identity matrix, but in 2n dimensions fashion. And omega inverse is equal to omega transpose. Determinant omega equal to 1 plus 1. So it has all these interesting properties. Yeah. It's purely a numerical matrix in this form. What that does is something miraculous, and I'm going to put a sheet here and write it down. It takes this set of equations, and writes it in one line as x dot equal to not the gradient of the Hamiltonian, where by gradient I mean delta over delta q, delta over delta p, p1 to q1 to qn, p1 to pn in this fashion. I mean those derivatives, but omega times this quantity here. So it's almost like a gradient system except for the multiplying by the matrix omega here. In fact, it is so crucial. Let me write it out here. X dot equal to omega times gradient of h. So you might call it, you need a word for it. It's called the symplectic gradient because this is the gradient with respect to the phase space variables, and there's an omega sitting in front here. What is interesting is that if I call omega the elements of omega, let me call them little alpha beta, where 1 is less than equal to alpha and beta less than equal to 2n. Now I'll use Greek symbols for indices, Greek indices for indices which run from 1 to 2n in phase space, and Latin indices like I, J, K, etc. for things which run from 1 to n, either in momentum space or in configuration space here. And I'll denote the elements of this numerical matrix omega by little omega alpha beta here. Then what this equation says is x alpha dot is equal to omega alpha beta del beta times the Hamiltonian, where there's a summation over repeated indices beta understood here. You can easily check that this is Hamilton's equations once you put this omega here in this fashion here. What is extremely interesting is that this thing here, qi, qj equal to 0 equal to pi, pj, and qi, pj equal to delta ij. This set of equations, relations, canonical Poisson bracket relations, goes over in a very compact way to x alpha, x beta equal to omega alpha beta. So the entire set is compressed into this little equation here. And this is suggestive of the fact that this omega is somehow playing a very weird role. It's playing the role of a metric in this phase space, in some specific fashion here. And indeed, that's true. Because if you look at the Poisson bracket of two functions f and g, we saw that it had a definition as delta f over delta q, delta g over delta p, minus delta f over delta g, and delta P delta G over delta Q. This Poisson bracket now turns out to be written in a very, very compact form. There are derivatives with respect to Q here. So it will actually look like the gradient in phase space of this function f transposed with an omega here times the gradient of the function g. It is like a dot product of this gradient with that gradient, this gradient here with this gradient. It would be a dot product in the usual Euclidean sense if you did not have this omega, but you have this omega sitting out here, and this is what the meaning of the Poisson bracket is. It's just telling you, remember that g is a function of the phase space variables, so the gradient of g is normal to the level surfaces on which g is a constant. Similarly, f is a function of the phase space variables, and gradient of f is a function which is directed in the direction normal to the level surfaces of f. And when I said gradient f transpose times gradient g equal to 0, I mean that these level surfaces would be normal to each other in this fashion. At each point, these guys would be perpendicular to each other. Here. But now this is not an ordinary gradient. It's a gradient with this metric here. So this really stands for what is called the symplectic gradient. And that is the true meaning of a Poisson bracket, that these gradients, the dot product, the symplectic dot product is actually 0. That's what is meant by saying Poisson bracket of two functions is 0, or saying that the functions are in involution with each other. This is the interpretation here. And now we can interpret canonical transformations also in a very simple fashion. And let me do that. Let me first write out what happens to, maybe the previous slide showed that. Yes, I already said that x alpha with x beta is omega alpha beta. We could also ask, what is the Poisson bracket of x alpha with some function of the phase space variables? What is this equal to? This will turn out to be simply, well, I want to erase it. Using the relation we already did, namely, we know that it's the symplectic gradient of this with that. This will turn out to be omega alpha beta del beta times f. Just turn out to be that. So you can see it's more and more looking like a kind of metric in this space, in phase space here. And what we have to ask is, what does it say for a canonical transformation? And that's where the interesting part comes. So let me do that. Yes. So under a CT, so let's say that X, which is, let me just write this equation down and then we are done. So X stood for Q and P. And let's suppose that under a canonical transformation, it goes to some xi, which is a function of capital Q, which is capital Q and capital Q. Then saying that the Poisson bracket is unchanged under a canonical transformation implies that the Poisson bracket of xi alpha with xi beta here was also equal to omega alpha beta, because the same was true for the x's. But we already know how to write this as the symplectic dot product of two quantities. So this is equal to del alpha, sorry, I should use different symbols here. Well, I'm going to leave this as an exercise for you. Show that this set of equations written in matrix form is nothing but the following. Show that this is equal to the Jacobian matrix delta xi over delta x, transpose, of course, on this side, omega, and then delta xi over delta x. This is the Jacobian matrix of the canonical transformation. is equal to, on the right hand side, not surprisingly, omega itself. So we have a condition which says that for a canonical transformation, this condition must be satisfied by the Jacobian, point by point, at every point in phase space. Whenever you make such a transformation, this must be satisfied. Let's call this Jacobian matrix M. Then it says a transformation is canonical if and only if M satisfies the condition M transpose omega M equal to omega. What does this remind you of? What is the corresponding condition for an orthogonal matrix? Let's go to the next page. So I have matrices describing canonical transformations which must satisfy M transpose M equal to omega. What is the condition for a matrix R to be an orthogonal matrix in ordinary Euclidean space to describe a rotation? What's the condition that the matrix R is orthogonal? How do you define an orthogonal matrix? Well, I won't.
There's
Take a
a
guess.
R transpose R is identity.
R transpose R is equal to the identity matrix. Okay. Orthogonal. And they describe rotations in ordinary Euclidean space here. You've heard of Lorentz transformations? In
Yes.
special relativity?
Yes.
Okay. So in space-time coordinates, t, x, y, z, for instance, if lambda is a Lorentz transformation, a special Lorentz transformation, what is the condition obeyed by this lambda? It's lambda transpose the metric matrix lambda and be equal to G. And G is just in flat space-time, it's equal to 1, minus 1, minus 1, minus 1, and zeros everywhere. It's the metric matrix. Is this orthogonal? Is this lambda orthogonal, this 4 by 4 matrix? Would you call it orthogonal? Well, if this were a unit matrix instead of G, I would certainly call it orthogonal. But it's not a unit matrix. But it looks like the orthogonality condition, right? So this is some kind of pseudo-orthogonal. Not orthogonal, but it's pseudo-orthogonal with the G sitting here. And G is the metric matrix. But we know that we found that canonical transformations look like this. This also looks like some kind of pseudo-orthogonality, except that omega is playing the role of G here. So what is ending up happening is that in phase space in Hamiltonian dynamics, this matrix omega is playing the role of a metric matrix. Omega, alpha, beta, its elements are looking like more and more like some kind of metric in this phase space here. That's going to be our definition of canonical transformations, something whose Jacobian looks like this, completely equivalent to saying the Poisson brackets are unchanged, the canonical Poisson brackets are unchanged. What we need to show is that the determinant of M must be +1. How do we do that? Well, let's take determinant on both sides, and the determinant of a product of determinants is the product of individual determinant. Determinant of a product of matrices is simply the product of the individual determinants. So we have determinant M transpose, determinant omega, determinant M equal to determinant omega. And determinant omega we know is 1 in any case. So this portion cancels on both sides in any case. So this is equal to 1 on the right hand side. And determinant M transpose is the same as determinant M. So it says determinant M squared is 1, which means this is equal to ±1. But I've already said that a canonical transformation is also orientation preserving. So its Jacobian must be +1. So this is the correct sign here, +1.
Actually, I gave them an exercise to prove it in general.
Yeah. To prove that it's -1 is, to prove that it's +or-1 is very easy. To prove that it's +1 is somewhat less trivial.
So, but they had an assignment where they proved it.
Yeah. So, but you can prove it without too much trouble here. Okay. So these such matrices form a group because if M and N, by the way, a matrix which satisfies this condition M is a symplectic matrix. And they form a group. They form a group for the simple reason that if you took two such matrices, M and N, all you have to do is to test whether Mn transpose omega Mn is equal to omega or not. Given that M transpose omega M is omega, and N transpose omega N equal to omega. Given that, it's easy to show that this is true. And M has an inverse. In fact, we know what the M inverse is. It's the inverse of a canonical transformation, is also a canonical transformation. The determinant is +1 once again. So they form a group. And the group has a name. The name is the symplectic group. It's written as SP 2n because we're in 2n dimensions, and we're restricting ourselves to the real values of our elements. So SP2nr. So we've come to the stage where we've seen that canonical transformations in an n-dimensional phase space, 2n-dimensional phase space, the Jacobians a group or the symplectic group SP2nr. What we have to identify is how many such parameters there are, what are the conditions it imposes on this M, and what sort of matrices are symplectic matrices, and so on and so forth. How many generators are there for this group, etc. This we'll do next time. So is this a good time to stop, Suresh?
Yes, yes, Bala. Floor is open for questions. You can come here and ask.
Maybe I should. How do I get to this other workspace? How do I get to the earlier?
You just quit the sharing. Stop sharing, you play. Stop
But
sharing,
then if anybody asks a question where I have to write, I won't be able to do it.
so you have.
Well, let me quit in any case. And
now you can see. Now you can see.
Now I can see. Yeah, I've stopped sharing. So,
yeah.
Well, I'll say it orally, and if necessary, I'll write it down the next time. Yeah, I have to be exceedingly careful with this stylus because once it falls, that's the end of it. Yeah.
They're all very strong, silent types. They're not asking anything. So,
well, either that or the whole thing has been totally trivial, and therefore there's nothing to ask.
How about the next lecture? When should the next lecture be? What about the next? There will be a second lecture. When should it be? You guys are free all the time now or afternoon? Afternoon plus free. Friday?
Are there live classes being in-person classes being conducted?
No, I don't think so. Right? Classes are still online. Even though they are half the classes here, right? Other half they haven't come.
Oh, I see. I see.
So shall we do it on Friday, Bala, or is it Thursday or Thursday?
What days of the what day would that be? What date would that be?
Friday is Dasara. Okay. Apparently
Just,
Friday is Dasera, so it's a holiday. Huh? Okay. Then Thursday, Bala. Thursday.
Thursday, just 1 second. In sheer desperation, Thursday, there's something going on Thursday. Thursday is the 14th. Uh, Thursday, well, I'm not free in the evening after 6:15. There's a conference.
No. We do it like today. We start
Okay,
at 2:30.
that should be
2:30
okay.
to 4.
Yeah,
On
yeah.
Thursday. That works?
yeah.
No.
Th-
It
Thursday,
doesn't.
Thursday doesn't work.
You have? That way somebody will have. Right? That's your personal thing with your advisor. No? Then someone else will also. One person missing is okay. Right? I mean, the recording will be there. But it's not a class-wide thing, right? Okay. So, Bala,
Yeah.
Thursday 2:30 again. Thursday 2:30
Thursday.
to 4.
Thursday is the 14th, right? That is 14th now, October.
Yeah, 14.
2:30 p.m. Okay. Because with this internet, with this online, there are all kinds of things going on. There's a meeting in Warsaw on random matrices and similar and stochastic quantum processes. Arul is speaking in Warsaw on
There can be
Thursday.
others also. Okay, so Thursday, Bala. Thursday 2:30.
Thursday, okay,
2:30 to 4.
okay.
So I want a confirmation. Will
Just
there
stop
be
the recording.
recordings for this thing?
Is this being recorded at all?
Yeah, this is being recorded, but I don't know if it will be given or not.